Great evening and welcome to the opening of the solo exhibition of Ydessa Hendeles. Death to Pigs is the rather provoking title for the first comprehensive institutional show and retrospective of the Canadian artist in Europe. The exhibition presents complex works that the artist has created over the past 13 years. Ydessa Hendeles' work is informed by her own biography and connects to questions of personal as well as national identity. She brings together historical and cultural artifacts that together create elaborate installations and present themselves as a subjective reading of our, and I think this is very important, of our recent history. Death to Pigs unfolds a multi-layered narrative about power dynamics and social mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. The works in the exhibition convey reflections of belonging, otherness, and exclusion, and touch upon the challenge of finding a place in the world within the context of history, generation, culture, and nationality. They take the vivid imagination of childhood fairy tales as a departure point, and at the same time investigate our social and political capacity to put constructive forces to deconstructive ends. Hendeles demonstrates how much the political is also part of our private life. Her works oscillate between hope and hopelessness and show how utopian ideas have also been put to, and I also think this is extremely important, utopian ideas also being put to dystopian ends. Through looking back into the past, she challenges us to ourselves what a common political future can look like. Before we open the exhibition in about 20-25 minutes, I'm very glad that we have two experts on Ydessa Hendeles' works in practice here with us tonight. I welcome both Gaëtane Verna and Markus Müller. Gaëtane, where is she? There. Has been director of the power plant in Toronto since 2012. Under the title The Millionaire's Daughter, Gaëtane Verna recently curated the first major institutional exhibition of Hendeles in Canada. Prior to her position as director of the power plant, Verna was executive director and chief curator of the Museum of Art in Joliette and I cannot pronounce it, Lonondier? Oh. Yeah, in Quebec. In Quebec, that's probably a little bit more known. Since 2006. I have never been there. I probably should visit. From 1998 to 2006, she was the curator of the Foreman Art Gallery of the Bishop's University, while also teaching at the art history department of the Bishop's University and the University of Quebec, Montreal. She has made many contributions to multiple collaborative projects with institutions such as the National Gallery of Canada and the Walter Phillips Gallery, among many, many others, and has an extensive list of publications to her name. Markus Müller is an art historian, journalist, curator, and has known Ydessa Hendeles' work for many, many years. He is the founder and director of Büro Müller, a communication and consultancy firm in Berlin. Müller studied art history, and American studies at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum, the Royal Holloway College in London, and the American University in Washington, D.C. Before founding Büro Müller in 2007, Müller was the deputy director and head of communication of the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin and has been director of communications in the department for Documenta 11 in Kassel. Additionally, He worked for the 3rd and the 4th Berlin Biennale, etc., etc. He is a curator and known for his expertise in music and, of course, in contemporary art as such. Thank you very much. Please, can I invite you to, thank you, to go a little bit in depth. And this is also a new practice for us, a new kind of opening. Welcome.
Okay, Nicolas, thank you so much for having us. Thanks for that invitation. To all of you who do not know Ydessa Hendeles' work, well, embrace yourself. You are about to experience something really unique. For those of you who know her work, well, embrace yourself, because it's never the same. It's always changing. It's always different. As Nicolas has just said, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. As Nicolas has just said, Gaëtane curated the first institutional retrospective by Ydessa in Canada, in Toronto, last summer 2017. And now, as some of you might know, Ydessa is originally a Toronto citizen, but how did that come about, Gaëtane?
So maybe 2 years before 2017, Ydessa had an exhibition at the ICA in London, where she presented the work from her wooden sleep. And I remember visiting this exhibition and also being I had heard that she, in 2012, she closed her foundation, which she had since 1987, which was really a landmark institution in Canada, where for us young curators and the public, it was the one opportunity in the city where you would see some of the best art and artists from around the world. And also over the years that she had this private foundation, she also curated the space like no one else would curate the space. And I had heard that, she had, as she closed the foundation in 2012, that she's moved to being an artist/curator. And so I was really surprised to be in London and to find out that she was having a solo show in London, and automatically thought, well, if she's, she's showing outside of Canada, she should be showing in Canada and in Toronto, in her hometown. So it's really from seeing from her wooden sleep that started the whole process of our project.
What is kind of interesting is that in her artistic work, it almost feels like some kind of a meta-curatorial approach. So we will see found material, collected material, in some cases almost typographies of certain things, but we also see produced material that is interlaced. Somehow I was reminded of classical old European tropes of working with these kinds of agglomerations. So Abi Warburg and his Mnemosyne Atlas come to mind, or Malraux and his Musée Imaginaire. Now the power plant is a non-collecting institution. What does it mean to bring these kinds of objects and historical constellations into an area where you usually have regular come and go and no material memory?
Yes, in an institution like the power plant, which is very much like a Kunsthalle model, we are always fighting with this notion of legacy. What stays after an exhibition that's presented in an institution such as the power plant? And then also what creates a type of legacy within the history of exhibition making in the institution? So one important point in terms of kind of thinking of that legacy was the context that when I invited Ydessa to exhibit at the Power Plant, it was 2017. And in Canada, I don't know if you're all aware, but in 2017, Canada was celebrating 150 years, which is quite a young country compared to European older countries. But nevertheless, this question of what does an institution that is non-collecting, what do we celebrate and how do we celebrate? Or is it our role to be celebrating these statewide type of legacies? And so for me it was interesting also, you know, having been a curator in a museum who had collections, I'm obsessed with objects, and any opportunity to be able to enter objects within the institution is one that I would always take. And Ydessa's work, which creates this narrative through found objects, constructed, built environment, I thought was a real great opportunity for the Power Plant, because our audience is not used at all to see that type of installation within the walls of the gallery. And also, we often use white spaces. We often have very, bland white neon lighting. And so the type of environment that Hendeles creates is a complete shift. So not only the environment she creates, the objects she brings in, and the narrative that she brings in through these objects is a complete shift for an institution such as ours.
Now, leaving the obvious differences aside, the Power Plant has a different architectural setup than the Kunsthalle. This exhibition still is, how would you describe that? Is it a sibling? Is it, has it morphed into something else? What are the differences? How would you describe the differences between Toronto and Vienna, now having seen both?
I would say that it's an organic next chapter into, you know, if we take the first encounter with From Her Wooden Sleep, which then I brought to Toronto, and within From Her Wooden Sleep, we had the title was The Milner's Daughter. There was the addition of past work and the creation of new works. And so from that group of works presented here, we've added another layer. We've also have a new title, you know, Death to Pig, which tells a different narrative from The Milner's Daughter, which if one, within the context of what we were doing in Canada, there was that notion of wanting to kind of speak of an important part of the history of Toronto and of Canada, which is the massive European immigration after the Second World War in Toronto, the Jewish immigration in Toronto, and then the reference of the title, The Milner's Daughter, makes reference to Ydessa's mother and her past work. You know, they had a shop where she made hats in Poland, and then the fact that, you know, it was really the notion of the survival of the mother, the creation of the narrative of the family is really important in the exhibition we had at the Power Plant. And so it's very interesting to see the same body of work presented in another space and adding a new series of works to it, and how it creates a different narrative, also because the context of, you know, Vienna today is a different context from Canada. So I think in reading the work of Hendeles, you always have to, and that's the same for every exhibition, the context in which the work is presented changes, because as this is the work that Nicholas and Ydessa did together here. How do you bring this work within this context, and what is the narrative that is underlying in the questions that are being raised by the work of the artist?
Just to come back to that initial context in Toronto, you said that you picked Ydessa in her artistic practice to showcase in the context of the 150 years commemoration of the founding of Canada, which means that you basically focus on the post-war, or one aspect of the post-war of the post-war history of Canada, and bringing it to Vienna quite obviously now turns the tables, yeah, where Ydessa was an immigrant. She, of course, here is an immigrant, so this is where she had to leave from, coming to Toronto. Now, which also brings us to the fact that in her artistic practice, one starting point usually is to refer to her personal history. That these are expressions of a very personal journey. But I was wondering, especially when looking at your program right now, you have Das Lied der Deutschen from Emeka Ogbo, a Nigerian who worked on the German national anthem, and an exhibition by Kada Atia. And I somehow, it may be really far-fetched, but somehow I tend to think that maybe these practices have something in common. Maybe Ydessa's is both a very personal but also a almost anthropologically universal notion of creating. Yeah? What would you say to that?
I mean, I would totally agree. I'm mostly interested in artists who have a practice who starts with the personal and very quickly becomes the universal. And I think that, yes, of course, when somebody reads the biography of Ydessa, her personal history is embedded in it. But I think as an artist, what she's really trying to do is also refer to universal themes. And those universal themes and the link with Kader or Emeka, so this notion of otherness, this notion of inclusion, this notion of citizenship, this notion of I would say, you know, personal survival under different conditions, and I would say also this shared commonalities that everybody wants to be part of a community, and the shared experience that everybody has of being excluded or being included or being looked upon. And I think that in that context, if one looks at the work that we have of Kader Atia, and I think one of the works that we're showing was shown here at the Kunsthalle, he really reflecting memory. In that work, he talks of the syndrome of phantom limbs, which means that when there is a severed limb, that can be repaired physically, but there's still, the body still feels the angst and the pain of what is irreparable. And I think that this, when we look at the histories that are going on right now, if we think of Syria and, you know, and so on and so forth, there are things that can be physically repaired, but how does one repair the soul? How does one address these questions? And this are questions that we all share, and that I personally is something that I'm always striving to bring forward, because I truly believe that through the humanity of artists and this question of universality and of shared experience, maybe if we all took time to listen, to look and to analyze, and to, instead of looking at at people that are different from us as others, but actually, you know, it seems very basic, but one would wonder why humans are not doing it more, to actually see ourselves within the eyes of the others. And so I think in Ydessa's work, through the use of children's fairy tales, through those very basic moral stories that are always trying to depict the good and the bad, she's trying to take us along into that same narrative and to force us in a completely different environment than the one that we're usually accustomed to seeing into an artwork, and hopefully to get us to think of those questions of repair, those questions of otherness, and those narrative, how do we as individual spectators, how do we address them very personally as well as globally?
You mentioned the use of imagery textbooks that are firmly based in children culture from a couple of decades in some cases even more than a couple of decades ago. And when one looks at the death of pigs, I found it quite remarkable that from the very beginning you have these tiny, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's something between a semiophore and a torpedo. You have the story of Zambo, you have, which is basically a colonial narrative about a white woman's fantasy of an African kid, and you have the figure of the Gollywog, which for at least the German context is something like the Struwwelpeter in a way. And you also have a wall of kids chorals, songs, where there's one double page with Robinson Crusoe and a Friday that is commanded by Robinson's bird, basically, to deliver a cookie. Now, for me, these are, these things come in rather gentle and all too well-known disguises, but there is a surprising brutality to some of that, and a surprising, in the reality of political correctness, or in post-colonial times, you're quite surprised how unfiltered racial prejudices were visualized in children's books. Yeah? Is this also something that's new to the Vienna realization? Or I think the Gollywog always was part of, but the Zambo, I think, is new to that specific piece. Yeah.
Well, I think that when the show was presented in London, they were very worried about the Gollywog. But I think that the great thing also with this exhibition and all the work that Hendeles does is there's extensive notes attached to each of the pieces, which actually there's barcodes, so people will be able to have access to those notes that have been written by the artist. And in this note, you also understand the narrative of why she's integrating these images within the narrative. So it's like yesterday we were talking about a wedge, It's something that she inserts at every level, because to also make us realize that a lot of these stories originally, when they were written, they were all written in a very positive, the image of the Gollywog, the original Gollywog, is a very positive character. But the original authors didn't copyright the image of the Gollywog. And then as time goes, it becomes used as a derogatory term. The image is mostly racialized, and then and the same happens in Sambo, who originally is an Indian boy. He's not a black boy, because the reference is with a tiger. So it's also to talk about. She presents, so that was in London, that was in Toronto, but also when you present these works within a context, and that as an institution you bring those subjects forward and you discuss what does it mean, that representation, and why would an artist like Ydessa integrate this? Now, if we go back to her own biography, again, this question of otherness. So she's not afraid to also speak of how the world looks at a whole other group of others. It's not only about herself, it is about this question of race, which is still, if in the US we have Black Lives Matter, that means that still in 2018, this question of the black body within the scope of the world is still an issue. And that whatever was said in those children's stories in the 19th century, we all know that this is not true, but regardless of this notion, we still see how black refugees are being treated differently than white refugees. So these questions of racism are still at the center of the geopolitical world in which we live. So I think it's very courageous, and there's this notion of universality, to not just be preoccupied with one's own biography, but to actually open the discourse into, when she speaks of others, she's not only speaking of the Jewish otherness, you know, in relationship to Catholic and Protestants, but she's also talking about racial otherness. All of these series of tropes that humans keep producing in order to differentiate one from another.
I think time's up. Is it?
I would love to listen to you and continue listening and listening. Yeah, time is up. We're almost open. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great. I think the show runs for a couple of months. You should come back, and then we have it's always a point of departure. How do we continue with a new conversation? And I think you should come back. Ydessa, there she is. Thank you so much for working with us on this really magical show.